Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. My name is Alyssa Ayres, and I'm Dean of the school. And I'm always thrilled to welcome people to book launches. This is a great way that we get to celebrate what we do with the Elliott School, which is produce leading edge knowledge of the best in international affairs. And couldn't be happier to be here for the book launch for Professor Nathan Brown and his co-authors, his colleagues. The book launch for Autocrats Can't Always Get What They Want: State Institutions and Autonomy Under Authoritarianism. We have all four co-authors of this book joining us, two here, two joining us remotely. And they can all rightly be called GW Zone, whether faculty or alums of programs here at the George Washington University. Professor Nathan Brown, who is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. He is also currently serving as Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies here at the Elliott School. Julian Waller, who is a research analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. Stephen Schaaf, the Croft Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Mississippi. And Samer Anabtawi, who is lecturer at University College London's Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. Doctors Waller, Schaaf, and Anabtawi all got their doctorates here at GW. So it really is a great example of bringing together a GW themed panel discussion and a GW themed book. And we're celebrating not only a fine work of scholarship, but our three outstanding alums and that essential relationship between teaching and research. This book, Autocrats Can't Always Get What They Want, looks to understand authoritarian rule. And that's no small feat, especially as the authors point out in a world where the definition of authoritarianism has come to encompass nearly all non-democratic rule. And so this book analyzes authoritarianism from the inside out, taking a look at the inner workings of state institutions. It also takes a comparative approach with chapters that go from Russia to Egypt to Thailand. What emerges in this study is a heterogeneous picture of authoritarian states where degrees of autonomy differ across regimes depending on the strengths of institutions and alliances. We're in a global environment where observers often describe the international landscape as divided into two factions, the authoritarian and the democratic. And this study offers a critical nuance that can help us better understand all states, authoritarian and otherwise. So in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to our authors who will offer their insights into the book and its implications for policymaking and policymakers around the world. And then we will be joined by our distinguished discussant, Elliott School Research Professor and Director of the Illiberalism Studies Program, Dr. Marlene Laruelle, who will offer her thoughts and lead further discussion among the authors. And then we will close things out with a discussion taking questions from all of you here. So my thanks to our authors and the speakers and to all of you who've gathered today to join us for this discussion. And I will now turn things over to Professor Brown. Congratulations on the new book, and we look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Ayres, for kind introduction. And thank you to my co-authors, Julian, Stephen, and Samer. And I also want to particularly thank Marlene Laruelle, who's visiting us from a couple floors down, and where she directs the Illiberalism Studies project. And there's a little bit of illiberalism kicking around our book, so I'm looking forward to hearing her comments. Let me just a practical word of introduction for the book. If you want a copy, there is one here to take a look at, but you can get it from the University of Michigan Press, and it is open access. If you wish to read it and have it and not pay for it, you can do so just by going to the University of Michigan site, and it's available there. If you want to pay for it, all better. That's a practical detail. What I'm going to do is sort of give some opening remarks just about the nature of the project and how it came into being, and then I turn it over to my co-authors. First, our my three-dimensional co-author Julian, and then the two flat co-authors, Stephen and Samer. And good evening, Samer, because it's almost evening for you. So when we speak in English, which I've been doing for quite some time now, and we talk about politics, an awful lot of our vocabulary actually isn't English in origin. It comes from democracy, dictatorship, and so on. These are words that come often from the classical word, Latin and Greek. And yet the most common kind of regime in the world today is authoritarian. And that's actually to refer to a regime type as authoritarian. It's actually about a half a century old. It's not much older than that. The word is a little bit older, but a distinct regime type known as authoritarianism. And when it first came into being, it would actually refer to very specific kinds of regimes. And it began to get broader and broader and broader. And now, at least when political scientists tend to use the term, they tend to define explicitly as, I mean, one prominent definition is, a democracy is a regime where political parties lose elections, right? If there's not a political party capable of losing an election, it's authoritarian. It's basically a residual category for non-democracy. And there's good reasons for that because of I would say, the normative importance of democracy for many people who are interested in politics. And it came out also of a real great interest in the downfall of authoritarian regimes, transitions from authoritarian regimes, and what is referred to now as the third wave of democracy. So the authoritarian regimes are the ones that didn't make that transition. And when you think about it, that may make an awful lot of sense, but it can be analytically a little bit difficult if you're taking all these regimes together. There's another interesting trend in the discipline of political science that is about a quarter century old, and that is to notice that when you have authoritarian regimes, you will often have structures like elections or parliaments or political parties that we associate with democracies, and they're operating in authoritarian regimes. Well, one way to do is just dismiss them. They're window dressing. But there's been increasing interest, as I say, over the last quarter century or so, in thinking, well, wait a second. Sometimes these are just more than window dressing. Sometimes they're a little bit different. I remember this was my inspiration for the book, being at a gathering. This was about 20 years ago. It was a discussion of Egypt. And the question was, why is it that Egypt has elections? And somebody in the room, it wasn't me, said, I don't think anybody ever asked that question, even the regime. Egypt has been having elections for 150 years. The question is, how are we going to use these elections? How are we going to design them? So the institution of elections or parliaments can sometimes be very, very old. Their meaning and meaning change. And that was sort of a starting point to think, well, authoritarian regimes actually differ an awful lot in what kind of institutions they have, how real they are, how viable they are, and so on. And there was a group of very talented doctoral students, a group that I didn't exhaust, but I turned to three of them whom you'll see here. Julian, who's worked on the Russian parliament, and completed his dissertation, what was 3 years ago? 2 years ago, okay. Stephen Schaaf, who completed his dissertation, I remember it was during COVID because it was a Zoom defense. It was, I think, in 2021, if I remember correctly, who'd worked on administrative courts in the Arab world and done an awful lot of work on judiciaries, especially in Jordan. And Samar Anabtawi, who also defended 3 years ago, I think. They'll correct me if I'm wrong. I should have written this down because my memory isn't perfect anymore. And Sam had written on LGBTQ movements in the Arab world and how it was that they pursued strategies to gain recognition and rights. And again, this is not a topic that one associates with authoritarianism. So the prevailing answer in the discipline of political science, when you come to the question, is to say, okay, people notice, well, authoritarian regimes that have parliaments that seem to have some kind of vitality last a little bit longer. They must be serving some kind of function for the regime. There is a parliament in place because it helps the regime be authoritarian. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes you can point to very specific ways in which authoritarian regimes have designed institutions, sometimes from scratch, in order to perpetuate themselves over time. And sometimes not. Sometimes authoritarian institutions, state institutions in authoritarian regimes are a headache. They're dysfunctional for the regime. You have elections and the wrong party wins, or the wrong party does too well, or you have courts that are allowed to do this, and then they start issuing inconvenient decisions. There's a very famous incident which we mentioned in the book in Egypt, where the president of the republic is giving a speech, and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, basically the lead Islamic religious official in the country, and Al-Azhar is a university, mosque, research complex, but it is a state institution. The Sheikh of Al-Azhar is on the state payroll, and he starts shaking his head like this, and the president of the republic just looks at him and says, "You wear me out." And it's a kind of a famous moment. This was the one in a regime that was clamping down. This was one of the real pockets. Al-Azhar, this institution, was one of the real pockets, not of opposition, but of just being a real pain for the regime. And so that's what we were looking at, trying to understand that variation. And we were looking specifically, we look at three kinds of institutions in the book: parliaments, constitutional courts, and religious establishments, and asking sort of when is it that they are able to get some kind of autonomy. And by autonomy, what we mean is a couple things. One thing is what we call internal autonomy. That is, when do they have control over their internal operation? Promotion and appointments and that sort of thing. And then what we call mission autonomy. When is it that they're able to actually go so far as to say, we have a vision for what we want to do, a vision for the rule of law, a vision for how to write legislation, a vision for how to distinguish what religious truth is, that is distinct to the institution, that they're able to sort of generate within the institution internally and pursue in some kind of way. Maybe something a little bit less ambitious than a full policy agenda, but still some kind of vision. And so that's what we do, and we try to explain that variation in the book. And I think I will bring my overall discussion to the end and turn to the three co-authors. There's Julian.
Sure, sounds great. So what I thought I would do, our two remote co-authors are going to dive into some of the cases. Stephen is going to dive into religious establishments. Samar is going to dive into the constitutional courts. I could take my time and talk about parliaments, which was sort of the section that I had led, but I'm actually going to give you the sort of push on why this book is an interesting contribution. It's a fun contribution, and in fact, in some ways, a spicy contribution, perhaps a provocative contribution. And that'll lead into our broader, I think, discussion that should naturally lead into Q&A and Marlene's comments as well. So I have sort of three provocations. That the book is a weighty thing. There's lots of moving parts in it, given the relatively simple argument, basically saying that authoritarian regimes are a lot more complicated than you think, and autocrats can't always get what they want. We actually make notable interventions, and we do this in an academic style with reference to the comparative authoritarianism subfield in political science. But at the end of the day, this is going to be of interest not only to academics, it's also going to be of interest to policymakers, those thinking about 21st century authoritarianism, the fact that, again, the majority of countries around the world today are authoritarian. So what does that mean? What does this label add as value? So three provocations. I'll bring the three provocations and then maybe one policy recommendation that comes out of it, although more implicit than explicit in the book at present. So the first provocation, and this is, I think, where we're going to have a very interesting debate in reviews of the book in the field, in academia, is this question of what are institutions good for in non-democracies, in authoritarian regimes? Are they always there to simply provide function? Do they do something for the ruler? And we argue that this is not always the case and that we've overemphasized this. We even give the set of scholars who use this set of argumentation that, for example, the parliament exists because it co-ops elites, or it distributes rents, or it does X, or it does Y, or it does Z, or the constitutional court ruled this way or that way because it serves the autocrat somehow. We call this functionalism. We don't say it's wrong. We say that it's something that you have to empirically test, you have to examine, and it has to be part of perhaps your theory of the case rather than an assumption that's built in. And too much of the literature, in our view, comes from this place of assuming that all these institutions, all these actions, all these policies ultimately are derived, well, because the dictator wanted it. And we know that's not true. We come from various area studies backgrounds. We've all lived in these countries in depth. We know it's not quite how that works. So we wanted to build a book around it. So functionalism is our academic boogeyman. Many people are not going to like that. And most people, most of our colleagues would say that they're not functionalists, that it's much more nuanced. And indeed it is sometimes. When you read the books and you read the papers, the nuance falls away very quickly. And we want to bring that back in, and we want to make sure everyone is extremely specific when they're trying to make these arguments, that they're not being too loose in terms of language. When is it the case that this is because of regime intentionality, regime will, regime function? And when is this something path dependent, or it's based on history, or it's just random happen chance that this has happened to work out the way it has, or part of a struggle, right? In which we shouldn't assume ruler intentionality or regime intentionality. So that's provocation number one. If you're an academic in this field, that's worth enough because it hasn't been said quite this way before, as far as we're aware. Okay, point two, defining authoritarianism. We spend an entire chapter talking about how there are different definitions of authoritarianism, that it's a relatively new term, and that the field has ultimately ended up saying that authoritarianism, when we say an authoritarian regime, we mean a non-democratic regime. What that means is it's a residual category, and that means that authoritarianism is highly diverse. It's much more variable in the structures within the political system, in the nature of authority, how it's exercised, the ways in which it's exercised, even the terms we use: military junta, absolute monarchy, electoral authoritarian regime. Saudi Arabia and Hungary are incredibly different regimes. They're both authoritarian regimes, but how much does that actually tell us? So where we pull this out and we make it very clear that the residual definition works, it has academic utility, and we use it. We spend a lot of time to get to the point where, well, actually the field's pretty much on target for this, but we need to know why. And there's one little wrinkle with defining authoritarianism in this residual way, is that it comes up with another often unspoken assumption, which we can derive from the classics, derive from the Greeks, from Plato and Aristotle, Polybius, who talk about 6 different types of political regime, right? And they divide it into how many people rule, the one, the few, or the many, monarchy, aristocracy, polity, and whether or not they rule for the common good or an understanding of the common good, or they rule for their private gain. Right? So monarchy is the good form of rule by one. Tyranny is the self-interested, self-aggrandizing, malign version of monarchy. The same thing goes for aristocracy. Its parallel is oligarchy. And for rule by the many, in fact, polity, its opposite is democracy itself, according to the classical authors. The problem is that we find when people think about authoritarianism, we take this residual definition, they often build in this idea of tyranny, that ultimately the regime is only self-interested, it's just trying to make money, it's greedy, it's kleptocratic. In many cases, that's absolutely true. But again, this is something not to necessarily assume. These rulers, these state institutions, these regimes, they have their own visions of the good. They have their own visions of both self-interest and also interest of the state. The vast majority of military juntas emerge because they say the state or the nation needs saving. Now, they might be wrong. That doesn't mean that they're not thinking in those terms, at least to some degree. So we want to complicate that as well. That's a second provocation. A final provocation that we touch on at the end of the book in our last chapter, which I do recommend you read, is we start digging into democracy itself. The book is not about democracy, and yet it is in a way about democracy. And we ask, given there's such diversity, such variation, such heterogeneity across authoritarian regimes, both in time and in space, well, what makes democracy different? And what we find is that democracy really is distinct. authoritarianism comes in so many varieties. It's very hard to say one thing about it. It's many things for many people at many times in many places. Lots of caveated, nuanced language, detailed case understandings. But democracy is a little bit distinct. It's weird. It's actually quite new, relatively speaking, and we'll see how long it lasts in the long durée of history. What makes democracy different is that rather than certainty at the top and uncertainty among the state institutions that may or may not play a major role or a minor role in politics, questions of autonomy and institutionalization, it's the opposite. In democracies, the top is uncertain. The election outcome is uncertain. The officials who will rule you are uncertain. What's much more certain, especially in the liberal democracies of North America, the European Union, is the state is quite autonomous, relatively speaking. That's mostly an assumption built in to how we think democracy works. Think of checks and balances, think of the sort of disaggregation of authority across ministries and so on. And we think that this is actually a thread worth pulling and maybe something that we can talk about more in the Q&A. I don't want to take any more time, so I will leave you with just one policy relevant or related idea. I currently work in a national security think tank, government sponsored, and so we think about US foreign policy quite regularly. And as was mentioned, the question of the democracy-autocracy binary is a major part of current American foreign policy. It's been a part of American foreign policy for a long time. It's part of our messianic national identity in some ways, thinking of ourselves as this great city on the hill. And I think there's a lot of merit there. We don't want to debate the policy decisions per se, but we do have to understand that there's one thing to have a foreign policy of the democracy, autocracy binary. It's another thing for our diplomats in the State Department or our analysts in the Defense Department or wherever to think that because there's a binary in the foreign policy, that binary therefore means we're able to deal with autocracies in all the same way, and that we think that they all have the same politics. They very, very obviously do not. And in some ways, the fact that we all call them authoritarian can mask the fact that we really do need to treat these states as allies or as adversaries or as third-party partners distinctly. We need to look at the institutions within, we need to look at the politics within, and we do need to understand that unfortunately, it's just a lot more complicated than we'd like it to be. Those are my remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. Samer, why don't we go to you, University College London?
Perfect. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Nathan, for the introduction. Just quickly, I wanted to talk a little bit about my background and what got me interested in the subject, especially for somebody who studies LGBTQ politics. So I was born in 1990, and that is under Israeli military curfew. In 2006, I was just too young to vote for the first Palestinian parliamentary elections, and I thought, okay, a few years later, I would be voting for the next one. Until today, I'm still waiting for the next elections. So to say the least, I've been very familiar with both living under these sort of repressive government structures and capture my interest. And I'm also interested in the idea of democracy, hopefully once it is realized in the Palestinian context. So how did I arrive at this project? I was having a conversation with Nathan Brown, who was my dissertation supervisor, about a weird news story about Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas in 2016, basically establishing a constitutional court in Palestine. This was weird news because it was arriving at a time when the Palestinian executive was centralizing power in that branch. So things were not moving in a more liberal direction. And so I was curious, why a constitutional court now? I turned to the literature in political science as a graduate student, read about constitutional courts under autocratic regimes, and the literature was asking pretty much the same question everywhere. Why constitutional courts? Why independent courts and autocracies? And the answer is always a list of the payoffs that the regimes ended up kind of gaining from these courts. So looking at Palestine in that moment, the answer was going to be very simple. The Palestinian Authority having sort of lacking legitimacy at the time, no elections, There were questions about succession. There were some trouble with the parliament, remnants of the parliament. So basically, the Palestinian Authority wanted the pretense of legality. They wanted a legal rubber stamp. So the why answer was fairly straightforward. But when I started asking further, about the history of this court, where did it come from, I found out quickly that it had been in the works for over 10 years, and that the executive branch had tried to establish that constitutional court on numerous occasions and had to back down. So for me, the real question wasn't why they needed a constitutional court. It was, why did it take them 10 years to get what they wanted, especially in a regime that is both younger than I am, and also a regime that does not have any sort of strong contenders to challenge it. And quickly I realized that they had been trying to resist or to push back against resistance from civil society and NGOs, some reformers within the previous parliament that had been pushing in a different direction. And so the story actually did not turn out to be one where some autocrat thought of this grand strategy about how to prolong the rule with the constitutional court. The story ended up being as follows. The push initially came from reformers within the parliament. It was not from the executive. Then the executive branch thought, okay, maybe we can co-opt this and make it work for us. But then they made so many mistakes along the way. There were so many miscalculations that they had done. They had to recalibrate at every step of the way. So they've lost that battle multiple times, and they ultimately prevailed in 2016 after having weakened all of these sources of opposition, both from within the institutions of the Palestinian Authority, which was kind of a quasi-state at the time, but also from civil society. And so for me, the bulk of authoritarian politics, as I know it as someone who lives under that regime, or lived under that regime, was not in why Abbas was interested in this, but it was in why he couldn't get it for over 10 years, even though he had a lot of power at the time in a system that was not really institutionalized. So the bulk of authoritarian politics was in the kind of push and pull between the regime and institutions of the state and institutions of civil society. And so I think that is a really interesting question. What I really want to highlight here before I kind of close is for the students in the room, and that is, don't ask the easy question that you can answer based on the literature. So the why question would have been a very easy one to answer. And the question that really puzzled me as somebody who knew the literature and knew Palestinian politics was the when, the timing. And that was not a question that prevailed in the political science authoritarian scholarship at the time, particularly as it relates to legal institutions. So if there is a question or an observation that baffles you, that does not sit well with what you know and what you read in academic scholarly studies, this is the question that is worth asking. And I'll wrap up my comments here and hand it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Samer. Stephen?
Hey, everybody. So I'm going to briefly talk about the last empirical chapter we have here. So the organization of the book, the three body chapters we've got. The first one is looking at the judiciary. Then we have legislatures, and then we've got religious institutions. Each of those chapters start with a question of, when do insert institution achieve autonomy under authoritarianism? We do that first for the judiciary, then legislatures, then religious establishments. If our dependent variable is these two forms of autonomy that Nathan's been talking about, our main independent variables are linkages and institutionalization. And this comes up in every chapter. Linkages would be when an institution has ties to supportive constituencies in society, in the state, even the international arena. There are people that can come to their defense, that can lobby on their behalf, that can provide them with logistical and resource support. That makes it harder to rein them in. Institutionalization, we mean institutions that are adaptable. They are coherent. They march in lockstep rather than fragmented. They have a hierarchy to ensure top-down control within the institution. And they're also complex. They do a lot of things in society, so reining them in is much more difficult from the top down. So religious institutions on this complexity side, we might think of the number of things that they actually do in politics and in states over time in different contexts that ranges from serving as courts, serving as education institutions, an active role in policing, an active role in healthcare, an active role in cultural policy and taxation, in registration of births and the census. That this varies cross-nationally, but religious institutions or establishments are not just about proselytizing or divine truths. They do a lot of things that states eventually try to wade into, sometimes co-opt and sometimes try to push aside. So we've got the same question here in the religion chapter is when do these establishments get autonomy? Broadly, we have a very similar answer as in the other two chapters, like with parliaments, like with courts, institutionalization and linkages matter quite a bit. But this is our last empirical chapter, so we're starting to push to be a little more precise here and saying something like, well, it's not just linkages outright, but the type of linkages matter. So linkages to societal constituencies in general do help institutions achieve autonomy. They give them support. But if those constituencies are themselves very supportive of an authoritarian regime, with one example being the Protestant constituency in Nazi Germany, which was fragmented in its views towards the Nazi party, some were actually very supportive. It's more difficult to mobilize them to leverage your authority as an institution against that regime. And we're also saying, well, institutions' linkages to outgoing regimes can actually put them in the crosshairs to have more concerted efforts to take their autonomy away. Those linkages can be quite useful while the regime's in power, but be a liability after regime change. With some examples being from Thailand, which has many different regime changes over time, where the Sangha establishment's ties to the royal family actually became a liability in the 1930s when the military takes power from that royal family. So linkages matter, but it's not all linkages matter in the same way. In this chapter, we're also going into saying, well, linkages and institutionalization, these are two variables, but they work together in meaningful ways. So having ties to supportive societal or state constituencies is good, but if you're not institutionalized, if your organization is not coherent, it's much harder to mobilize those into a unified pressure group. So institutions with linkages will be much more successful if they're also coherent and able to have their house in order internally. So those are the broad strokes arguments that we have in this chapter. I'm not going to dive into all the case studies for time's sake. We can chat about them. But I will point out in this chapter, we're going a bit broader in our reach in the cases. So in the chapter on judiciaries, we're comparing Egypt and Palestine, which is a controlled close comparison. In the chapter on parliaments, we're primarily, but not exclusively, looking at Russia and the Kuwaiti Majlis. And here, when we get into religious establishments, we're starting to say, well, let's begin with two different periods in German history, Weimar rule, but also Nazi rule, and see how the Catholic and Protestant churches are interacting there. We then step into the Arab world and include Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And then we step even farther, perhaps out of our comfort zone, and include the Sangha Council in Thailand. And part of the reason we're doing that is religious institutions vary so tremendously in the line that they have between state and society, whether they are fully part of the state, whether they're de facto state institutions, but de jure somewhat blurry. Whereas when we're looking at parliaments, we actually see a lot of convergence in the forms these institutions take. We see a significant amount of divergence in the religious field, which pushes us to move to a much more diverse empirical strategy in our case selection. One last thing, a small thing, similar to what Samar was saying, outside of the religious terrain, one practical piece of advice I would give to junior scholars like myself when thinking about this book and what I would like to see it pushing the field towards is just changing the way that folks are asking research questions. Like, it's very common for people doing work on authoritarian institutions to say something like, why did an autocrat create a parliament? Why do autocrats allow judicial independence? Why do autocrats tolerate judicial independence, parliamentary autonomy? And those are very common questions that can be quite productive, but the slippery part of them is that they assume a part of their answer in by definition, which is that autocrats are doing it, that the agency lies in autocrats from the top down. And my preference would be something like, just ask, how did this institution gain autonomy? When did it gain autonomy? What factors led to it? And the answer might sometimes be autocratic top-down design. but it also might not be. And that's where we're having this inside out approach that we're trying to develop. We're not trying to push aside top-down theorizing. Just like sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. We shouldn't accept it by assumption. We should really try and tease it out empirically. I'll go ahead and stop now.
Okay, thank you very much. Marlene.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I will be giving, thank you so much for inviting me to be the discussant. I will be giving a few remarks and then we will open the floor for the Q&A. So first I wanted to congratulate all of you, of course, for the book. It's really a refreshing book. It's a provocative book on many aspects in a good sense. It's really renewing, the toolkit we use on our assumption and the question we are looking at when we think about authoritarian regime. It's really forcing us to shift the cursor on different aspects and really moving away from the leader toward institution, their autonomy, agency, and how authoritarian institution can be meaningful for actors and for citizens. So it's really forcing us to work on our kind of classic assumptions. And I really invite you, if you don't have time to read the whole book, to the first chapter that kind of summarized the core conceptual discussion on authoritarianism, and the last one, which is what Julian was saying, the kind of mirror game that is forcing us to take to look at democracy, are really excellent. And so what the book really, for example, helped me rethink is how much this notion of authoritarianism has been overstretched, how much it has been essentialized, and how much, in a sense, it has been otherized from democracy. Right? So, Julian, you were mentioning in the last chapter, it's really about kind of how democracy are different for authoritarianism. But when I was reading it, so it's my kind of provocative reading of your provocative question, I came up almost with something that, well, in fact, they share much more than we would imagine, right? That this binary is, of course, not existent in the real world and is probably problematic in the foreign policy world, but even conceptually, right? This kind of continuum, the way that we have to think authoritarian and democracy in a continuum more than in a kind of clear binary was, for me, very visibly appearing from the reading, the fact that democratic institutions are facing challenges at being accountable. You have a whole discussion in the book about accountability being one of the criteria that dissociate an authoritarian system from a democratic one. But it's difficult in a democracy to be accountable, right? Institutions are becoming problematic for democracy, the way it's functions in the Western world, because there are maybe needs for other form of democracy, or part of the population is asking for the institution to function directly. I think we see also on the international scene that challenges to the liberal world order as it is can be coming both from democracy and from authoritarian regime, sharing the same interpretation of the world order. So for me, it was much more about this kind of fluidity or kind of a mirror game. That's a lot of the kind of challenges that democracy are facing are also faced in their own ways by authoritarian regime around what do we do with institutions, and that you have shared ideological features that are kind of visible on both the democratic and the authoritarian side. So that was my kind of one of the key reading or kind of finding for me of the book. And then the book also helped me kind of continuing exploring notions that are there, that have been developed also in the book. They are not specific chapter, but you can read them across the book. One is how authoritarian regimes are managing time, right? How do we think the chronology of an authoritarian regime and its evolution? And usually the literature about evolution of authoritarian regime are always focused on, well, they will fall, right? It's about preparing the collapse or interpreting the collapse. But what if we think about evolution of an authoritarian regime outside of the issue that, yeah, there is a moment it will collapse. But how do we take care of, the internal dynamic, the fluidity, the kind of ad hoc capacity of adjusting, at reinventing themselves, how authoritarian regime can surprise the outside world and surprise themselves. And of course, I was thinking, because that is really put the kind of the autonomy of institution that you have in the book as a core element of this kind of things can be unexpected inside an authoritarian regime. You can get surprised, all actors, including the big leading figure. And I was thinking, as of course I'm working on Russia, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2022, the Russia at the moment of the full-scale invasion, I don't think anyone in the Russian regime would have imagined that one of the consequences of that would be that the massive investment in war production in Russia would have created a kind of military Keynesianism for the Russian state, that they have been redistributing money to depressed region and poor population in a way they would have never imagined doable before. So the war, paradoxically not for us external observer, but for the regime itself, suddenly created a space where they had to realize that they were investing money in the war and it was improving the social economic well-being of Russian citizens, which came to a surprise for them, that the war was becoming a kind of social promotion ladder for veterans. So a lot of elements that were not planned, but that the regime through institution also had to kind of reinvent suddenly a kind of new social contract that even themselves didn't see it coming. So I think that's for me this kind of adaptation capacity and the kind of long-term evolution of a regime is really something that I think the book is trying to capture through this discussion on the autonomy of state institution. The second element is that institution, as we can see from the book, have some form or develop some form of autonomy in the relationship to their leaders, but they are the one in touch with the average citizen, right? They are the one who have to manage the interaction with average citizen. And so they find themselves sandwiched sometimes between the pressure coming from the population and the pressure coming from the leader. And so I think it's clear in the judicial system, it's clear in religious institutions, which have their own religious-based legitimacy that can be very specific. And that has also it kind of a crowd of citizens that are following the religious institution. We could imagine if you would have had a chapter on media in authoritarian regime, you would also have that element. So you have all this, you know, and it has been a part of the literature, this notion of networked authoritarianism and how authoritarianism is functioning by capillarity, right? You need resonance in the society. You don't function only by repression. You need to create this resonance and you have feedback mechanisms to capture the population needs, and the institutions are playing also that role. And I was thinking also in the case of Russia, you have in Russia an online register of complaint that citizens are using widely, even in an authoritarian regime, even in a context of war, to complain about, you know, any kind of everyday dysfunctionality of administration. And the state has to reply and has to deliver. So institutions in the middle ground, right, found themselves really caught between the pressure from the regime to tell them you need to deliver and the pressure from the society using the tool and understanding it's a tool to improve kind of small everyday things in the system. And so my last comment, and maybe it was something that I think is also coming from the book and a kind of next step or continuation of the discussion, is that if we think about the autonomy of institution, how do we think about the autonomy of civil society, right? How do we rethink civil society in an authoritarian context, where usually it's considered that, well, you don't have one. And I think here also it's much more complex, and it's following this kind of will to complexify our conceptual apparatus when we think of that, is that you can have a civil society in an authoritarian regime. And when you look at grassroots actors, they are genuine civil society actors. They know how to function in an authoritarian context. They may be social consensus oriented. They may share some ideological goals for the regime, but they are also implementing genuinely autonomous in the room of maneuver they have of their own agency and asking for some form of accountability toward this institution in an authoritarian context. So I think what the book at the end, and it's to kind of close the cycle so with several of your comments, is that how do we also rethink common goods possible in non-democratic and non-liberal system? And how do we reintegrate that as being also part of the discussion. I think one of the issue of the literature has been very much to imagine that, you know, common goods can only come in a democratic liberal system. It's more complicated than that. I think there are other ways of framing it, and we need to recognize that there are actors and institutions that can be trying to frame common goods in non-democratic, non-liberal system. So that was my kind of the comments that the book generated in me when I was reading it. Really a pleasure to read it. So congratulations again. And I think now we have like, well, we are perfectly on time. We have 45 minutes now for the Q&A. So I will be happy to open the floor and select a few questions. We will ask you to introduce yourself, and there is a mic coming to you.
Thanks. Hi, Gordon Gray. I'm on the faculty here at the Elliott School. First of all, congratulations on writing the book. Look forward to reading it. And thanks for taking the time to share your insights on it. I've got two questions. One's less serious and short, and the serious question may be a little more difficult. But first question I have to ask is, who's the Rolling Stones fan?
If you want an immediate answer, I suggested the title, but I had to consult with my co-authors to see whether or not the cultural reference would be make sense to a younger generation, and it did. It did.
Oh, good, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that on all counts. The more serious question, perhaps beyond the purview of what you were looking at, when diplomats overseas, U.S. diplomats overseas, are seeking to promote U.S. values in autocratic societies, they're often looking for fissures, if you will, so that they can see how they can leverage either one against the other, or perhaps one against the regime writ large. Are there any policy recommendations that you would make to a diplomat going out to, you know, Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or you mentioned Thailand, and, you know, any of the countries you studied, or any of the other countries? Thank you.
I can start on this one, and then maybe someone else can jump in afterwards. That's a difficult question because I think at the end of the day, it's very much so country dependent. The reason why it's country dependent is U.S. policy is not always to overthrow an authoritarian regime that we're interacting with, whereas in other cases it is. And so in a situation where it's an adversary or we would like the government to change, there's probably an argument to be made that diplomats and intelligence activity, whoever, might be interested in identifying groups that are particularly oppositional, strengthening them. This goes back to the color revolutions and all of that, and sort of trying to promote capacity for protest mobilization. For a lot of countries, though, that's not necessarily U.S. policy. And not only just for practical reasons, but also because, like, we don't want to overthrow the Egyptian government right now, I don't believe. So as a result, it would be somewhat counterproductive to focus on a wedge strategy. Whereas something that might be useful, and this is just my personal opinion, is thinking in terms of actors that are parastatal, or that sort of bridge the state institutions and society. So in the case of the Middle East, there's lots of lawyers associations, bar associations, things like that, which might actually be filled with some pro-Western figures. At the same time, they're also pro-regime in many cases. And so a diplomat can actually gain quite a bit of knowledge on how the country actually works, how decision-making takes place, by just interacting on a very neutral basis with these kind of groups. You can do the same thing with local NGOs. And a point that Marlene emphasized with the idea of civil society in authoritarian regimes. We tend to think of civil society only when it's liberal and pro-Western and funded by us. But the alternative is also the case in many parts of the world where there's an illiberal civil society, or a civil society that you can't easily tag in a certain way. Historical societies, religious NGOs, things like that. Those are also useful actors for U.S. diplomats to engage with and sort of treat seriously rather than just as regime pawns. I think that there's a value add there, perhaps. That's, again, different views.
Yeah. I would give a more tortured version of the same answer. And I'll go back to Marlene's comment about sort of the institutions potentially being sort of in between sort of the leadership and the society and functioning in that way. A lot of the democracy and human rights programming that I've seen actually operate actually kind of takes that form. It's not, we're not going to bring democracy overnight. We're going to work with, judges or the judiciary, the Ministry of Justice to have a better case tracking system so that so that litigants can actually find out where they're in the court. Or we're going to enhance professionalization in the legal profession or this sort of thing. And the reason that's a kind of a tortured answer is, in a sense, you're not getting democracy that way. That is not democratization. What you're doing is making existing systems or parts of existing systems maybe function more professional, maybe a little bit more autonomously. You're probably gaining an awful lot of knowledge, as Julian said, simply about the workings of a system, and you're probably making it work better. It's just not democracy. What you're getting is perhaps authoritarian or public institutions that serve populations better, but within an authoritarian context.
And the question is that your policy? Because I think in many ways it is.
I think Steve.
I might add one more thing, and it's not something that would be necessarily advice for people that are already working in this area, but more on what you might expect. And this is secondhand. I've never worked in the Foreign Service, but I have friends who did. And so this is coming from a lot of experience in Jordan, is if you're doing this type of work, whether it's for the State Department, for USAID, for various rule of law promotion initiatives, which the US government spends around $1 billion a year doing cross-nationally, you're going to quickly find that you're working a lot with state institutions and not with the top level, what we call regime elites, right? So my friends in USA worked a lot with ministries of development to try and do building projects. And sometimes when it's building schools, that brings in ministries of education. If you're working in Department of State, you're going to be working with a lot of ministers of foreign affairs. And those people might be constrained by their linkages to societal constituencies. So think of Jordan's relationship with Palestine or with Israel. There are certain relationships with the public that these people have in mind, and our linkages start to matter in that sense. If you're doing rule of law promotion, you're going to be working with ministries of justice. You're going to be working with judicial councils, both presidents and chiefs of judicial councils, but also other members. You're going to be working with judges, and people already working in U.S. diplomacy know this. This is firsthand experience on a day-to-day basis. It would be more of a managing expectations for people about to is, sure, Abdullah is the king, but you're not going to see Abdullah on a day-to-day basis. You're going to be interacting with the institutional actors that we're trying to shine the spotlight in the book more often than not.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Dave Onspock, no affiliation. So I'm wondering, you talk about authoritarian governments. Some of you may realize the interesting hedonistic electronic dance music culture that exists over in the Balearic Islands of Spain and Ibiza and Mallorca and Menorca. But are you aware that culture descended from the hippie movement, which existed over there in the 60s and 70s in Spain during the Franco government, the fascist Franco government. So have you done research on how the hippie movement existed during the fascist, anti-queer, hippie, pro-Catholic integralist type of fundamentalist government in the 60s, how in the 60s and 70s, how the culture was allowed to exist over there in an authoritarian society? Thanks.
So we can't say we explored the sort of cultural policy of Frankist Spain. However, it is a little quirk of the book that Spain features rather prominently in some of the book's frameworks, Franco Spain specifically, and not only because we happen to get some of the seminal thinking on authoritarianism itself from Juan Lintz, writing in the last 50 years, and using the Spanish model as sort of a thought experiment on we need to go beyond the totalitarianism paradigm and so forth. But we also make a point that by the end of and this is perhaps another provocation we have, by the end of the Frankist period, just before democracy is on set, it's a very boring regime. It is a very boring staid authoritarian regime. It's relatively peaceful. It's mostly just trucking along. And in fact, its own institutions will be central to getting rid of the regime and ushering in democratization in the 1970s. And so it's a very interesting touch point case, not only in general, but I think also specifically for us, actually. So you're welcome to look at the index. We have multiple Franco references in there.
Please.
Hi, my name is Margot Treadwell. I'm a junior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. So I'm really interested in kind of the functionalism argument, and especially as it engages with how authoritarians kind of are people at their core and are not all-knowing and don't always make choices knowing where those choices lead, and especially with how that leads them to not just interact with state institutions, but international institutions. And when they kind of like make those choices, not knowing where those choices lead in terms of international relationships. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all to that, if that links.
Somebody online want to start with functionalism in the international sphere?
Sure. I think you're absolutely right pointing out autocrats don't always know what they're doing. Sometimes they have strategies in mind. Sometimes those strategies work. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're short-sighted. Sometimes they're long-sighted. And sometimes they're shooting from the hip. So this is just to say there's a lot of variation here. When you get to international institutions, which is taking us out of some familiar terrain from the book, so allow me to say with some more uncertainty than I would in other contexts, some of these arguments do still apply. Autocrats might have a reason in mind for signing the treaties they do, or joining the institutions that they do, and they could find that those reasons do change down the road. So just one quick example, and this is not from my work, but it's a study I remember from Jan Lupu, who's at GW as well, is states that ratify human rights treaties are much less constrained by those for civil and political rights. It's easier or more constrained by civil and political rights and less so for physical integrity rights. And part of the reason is like if you quash a protest, like there's some evidence, there's pictures, there's phones, those things are easier to police. So autocrats might accede to something like the Convention for Civil and Political Rights, not expecting to have to implement it and finding more pressure on the back end than they would otherwise expect. Whereas for physical integrity rights, you can torture someone in ways that necessarily don't leave marks, or detain them until the evidence fades. And so they're more capable of acceding to those as broadly cheap talk without actually being constrained. So the strategies might work in some contexts, but not others. But I can say that mainly referencing other people's work and not my own. I'm a comparativist and not an expert in international relations.
Couple observations. So the original title of this book, before I went with the Rolling Stones version, I think was Authoritarianism from the Inside. So we were really interested in how these political systems, how state structures interacted with each other. And one thing that I think, there are two dimensions I'm getting actually from this discussion, partly from Marlene's comment, partly from your question, of things we could explore maybe in volumes 2 and 3. The question of civil society, we certainly have civil society actors appear, but the nature of civil society would really affect the context in which these institutions are operating in ways we don't really explore systematically. And internationally as well, when states set up these structures, or when these structures emerge, they certainly operate internally, but there's sometimes links across borders where they learn with each other. I was having lunch with a friend of mine yesterday who's sitting right there, Samar Shahata, who's actually working on this for the Arab world about how it is that various structures work together and authoritarian practices get replicated across borders. So those are two things I think we could explore more. The international dimension doesn't turn up that much at all. Civil society, I think, is I think is part of our explanation, but it's not as systematic as we could be if we did write volume 2.
And I'll add one more thing to this, and I am also shooting from the hip on this one. But there's an interesting situation in Russia where for a long time there was a constant battle between Russia and therefore Russia's foreign ministry and the European Court of Human Rights, the various European courts, where Russian oppositionists would sue for various repression or issue areas or being like taken off the ballot or something like that. Alexei Navalny was one frequent example. And essentially Russia would just ignore these, but it'd be this long drawn out fight. And there would be like a BBC headline that Navalny wins X court case in The Hague or in Brussels, and it doesn't matter. Russia doesn't do anything about it. It's sort of a paper thing. It's technically pursuant to this. But at a certain point, when Russia is revising its constitution in 2020, when Putin's going to come back to the presidency again and zero out his terms, they actually make a point of saying that national laws supersede all international laws, even those that we've signed and have treaty agreements for. And usually the international law says the opposite. Especially liberal international law says that. In the United States, we don't believe that either, but we get a pass because we're the hegemon. But Russia wrote it into the constitution. And there's a question, why bother? And this is coming from a new book on the Russian judicial system by Peter Solomon and Catherine Hendley, which is fabulous. It's excellent. But like, why bother? Why not just have these fights over and over again? Well, maybe the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs wanted to do less paperwork and pushed it. We don't really have any evidence for that. Maybe they wanted to simplify things, but the Putin regime is never about simplification in terms of these sorts of administrative issues. They can just always just say no, no, no. But coming out of their research, it was actually the president of the Constitutional Court was like, I want to make sure that our law is legal and that we're doing this correctly. And we need to change this constitution. We need to change the law to make sure that we, Russia, are doing the right thing, because this is annoying and this is a little bit insulting. And perhaps it's offending our honor. And all these lawyers in Europe are saying that we are disregarding international law. And so Larry Zorkin made a point. It was like, no, it's in our constitution. We are not disregarding international law. International law just comes second to national law. So another example of like, that's sort of a constitutional court example, but there is agency, and that's obviously coupled by the Putin regime's not going to say no, but they also had to write it in. That had to be included, and put through the State Duma and set up for a referendum. It's a lot of steps, just because the Constitutional Court president was really annoyed at the situation and wanted to feel less embarrassed, or to defend the honor of the Russian Constitutional Court. So it's just another example. In any case, it's very interesting.
Do we have more questions? Yes. The mic is coming to you.
Thank you. I'm Pavlo Smitsnyuk with the Ukrainian Petrarch program here at the Elliott. I have a question, maybe to Nathan and Stephen, about religion and how it is understood, and what are the consequences of this understanding for whether the regime is more autocratic or more democratic. Like, some of the scholars of nationalism have pointed out how, like, the nation state at the moment of its inception, which then brings democracy, yes, often it sort of puts aside all sorts of other communities, tribe, clan, religion, university. It gets sort of the monopoly over power, over violence, and redefines religion, for example, or university or clan. So my question is, since you have mentioned many ways in which religion acts in those societies, yes, sometimes it has to do with education, with healthcare, etc. I know religion in Iran and in Russia, two different types of religion in India and I know Saudi Arabia also are different. So does the way religion is understood, is defined in society, has any influence on whether the regime is more democratic or autocratic? do regimes prefer to have religion playing a major role or a minor role, whether they can control it or not?
I think I would go with, on average, your last one. Whether they can control it or not is somewhat key here. Whether regimes would prefer religion to have a major or minor role. The vast majority of authoritarian regimes, they have religious establishments that long predate them. So when we're talking about Al-Azhar in Egypt, this was formed in the 10th century, right? It's not something that Gamal Abdel Nasser says, hey, we should create this. It's there, whether they like it or not. The same with the Catholic Church, in the construction of Imperial Germany. That predates those efforts, and regimes have to try to deal with them. The way they do so varies quite a bit. And you're right that that does, to a large extent, depend on the role of religion in society. But that role exists ex ante, and it's dealt with post hoc. And so, like normally, when we think about modern state building, in the Western European context, it's this disestablishment of religion. It's the separation of religion and state. In the cases that we're looking at here, we see the state seeking to absorb religion. So in Egypt, there is some separation, and it actually dates more back to the British colonial period, saying, hey, there's all these religious policies that we don't really know how to deal with. We would like to restrict the role of religion in society. And it starts getting pushed from a very broad scope to issues of personal status, to family law. Then we have the rise of authoritarian rule in the Nasser period. Then they see Al-Azhar, and it's a source of religion authority in a predominantly Muslim society. It's a very potentially powerful institution, and they absorb it into the state, make it a formal state institution rather than having it exist outside of it, with part of the logic being to try and control it, but also finding they made it a lot more powerful in the process and sometimes lost control more than they achieved it down the road. Do similar things in Thailand, where it's a very differently structured religious establishment. It's much more disorganized in the early period of Chakri state building. So around the early 1900s, the royal family, the Chakris at the time, still today, but absorb it and create a formal Sangha council. Different military regimes, as they took power, fundamentally reconfigured it, trying to align with their interests. So after the coup in 1932, they changed it to try and look somewhat democratic, saying there's a religious council of elders, a religious judiciary, mimicking the new institutions of military but less royal state. Then Sarit takes power again and says democracy is a problem in Thailand, so I'm going to reshape religion to be much more top down and authoritarian. So they are trying to manage religion, but religion is such a difficult thing to manage because it presumes that there is a transcendental authority that supersedes the modern state, and states have to grapple with that. This is also one of the contexts where you're very likely to see mission autonomy, people who genuinely have moral views on the right and the good that they're trying to promote in society, and they do that within state structures. The context varies from society to society, from creed to creed. So we're not trying to say what religion is. We're trying to look in different contexts, find how religion is organized there, and then track it rather than say this is the scope of what religious authority is. So quite a bit of variation. Regimes don't necessarily get to set the scope. They just have to manage it on the back end.
I would just highlight three things about Stephen's answer there. Number one, we're talking a lot about religion, but one of the key words is structure, right? So belief came in a little bit when he was talking about the good and so on, but for the most part, religion for us is ministries, structures, schools, and so on. It's institutions. It's bureaucracy, right? That's the first thing. Second is history. And he was going back, he wasn't necessarily going back to the beginning of religion, but he was going back at least to modern state construction. So when you take that long-term historical view, specific regime isn't necessarily the one that's inventing or reinventing it. And the third term was evolution. That was also a term that Marlene used in her comments. So the really interesting developments that we're looking at is not the invention of, we are going to do this with religion, take it in or out of the state. It's how are we going to, or how does the structure evolve over time? So the change is evolutionary, and in order to see big changes, you really, or the fundamentals of a system, you really have to look at more distant history than just the regime's policies in the last few years.
Is here in the back, and then one more question here.
Sorry. My name is Katerina Gvadwa. I'm actually a graduate student here in the IA program. And my interest specifically lies in post-Soviet countries, places like Republic of Georgia, Armenia. And it seems to be that there's a significant backslide in more towards falling in line with Russia policies and going back to how it was during the Soviet times. What kind of questions should we, as students and potentially people who are going to be going into this field, what kind of questions should we be asking to sort of start making changes in a more positive, more democratic direction? And in our research, sort of, to get you guys' opinion on it.
So how should we ask research questions that inform the potential for democratization
Yeah.
or re-democratization?
Yeah, like Republic of Georgia, Armenia.
Okay, it's an interesting question. There's there's this whole field of democratization studies and transitology and all of that, and we do a little bit of a head fake by saying we're only interested in the stable authoritarian regimes, at least for this book. Us personally, of course, we're interested in democracy as well and democratization. But we look at the stable stuff, and I think in the cases you mentioned, for example, Georgia right now, which most observers would say is undergoing at least some democratic backsliding, right? There have been protests. There's an election coming up. We'll see whether the ruling party is going to stay on top, things like that, right? These are sort of very open questions. I think what should let's say Georgia continue down a more autocratic route? I think what we would want to take from this is to not only look at what the literature has been looking at, or let's say researchers should not just look at protest movements, should not just look at oppositions, especially professional oppositions, or the professional political parties. In Georgia, there are many, and they're constantly feuding, and they're one of the reasons why the ruling party actually captured power, right? So there's a past here. But we should look at, for example, the Georgian Orthodox Church, which has increasingly come to support the ruling party, in part because the opposition is, at least some of them, started to oppose or discount or otherwise suggest that they're on the other side of the divide, right, politically. And that was a choice that was made, and there are ramifications for that because the Georgian Orthodox Church is widely revered and still very popular in society, even if that might be going down over time. So that's something to take a look at, is looking at this institution, which is not formally a state institution, but is not a fully separated institution as well. The Orthodox Symphony comes into play here, and the sort of aspects of national identity, which we don't cover. Another aspect is looking at, let's say, the parliament itself, or in the Georgian case, the office of the presidency. The president is not, in fact, the most important political authority in the country. It's either the prime minister or the person who's secretly running the show behind the scenes. Given that, it's important for us to dive into exactly what makes both the president either powerful or impotent, and how that's evolved over the crisis right now. I think those would all be incredibly interesting research questions, because that'll also tell you a little bit about levers of influence, and areas where you might be able to learn sort of tactics, lessons, and broader strategic picture for future democratization or re-democratization or what have you. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
That'd be my suggestion.
And so last question.
JP Hogan, I write about politics. I'm wondering more about how is America now seen around the world as we have politicians saying they're for democracy, but it's more they get voted in by machine politics, and then you'll find out what's in it after it's passed. But on the religious stuff, America, especially with the Iraq war and the Constitution afterwards, how they were founded. To Republicans, it was more you have freedom of religion. Democrats want you have freedom from religion. But if your rights are from your creator, you're then, as a citizen, responsibility to understand what is that concept. So it's not freedom from religion. It's a separation where you, as an individual, have your individual liberty to then self-govern in religion locally. So for the Constitution for Iraq, that was respecting people can have democracy as self-governing religion. It's not you vote for the authoritarian and then you're stuck. So I'm just wondering, is America seen as it's gone too autocratic with a ruling class, solutions tyranny, and
Mention something just about the religion part of the answer. I mean, one implication of what we're saying is that religious institutions are kind of molded within the state apparatus, but in very, very different ways. So what is religious freedom doesn't always travel very well. An American vocabulary about religious freedom doesn't necessarily travel well to a country where, for instance, you have a lot of European countries, you have an established church still to this day. I would say in Iraqi context, for a lot of Iraqis, religious freedom was not simply, it wasn't about freedom of conscience so much, it was freedom of each religious community in order to practice, and that often meant in family law, according to the teachings of their religion. So it was kind of, yes, Islam may be the established religion. What about non-Muslim communities? Do they have some autonomy by themselves? That's a concept of religious freedom that doesn't travel well to this country. And there were some debates about this with the Iraqi constitution. So I would simply say sometimes vocabulary specifically about religious and religious freedom is unique. I shouldn't say unique, but is very distinctive and varies from political system, one political system to another. I guess I'll leave the other part of the question, which is really about how American democracy is seen.
Sure. I mean, that's speaking of spicy provocative
Yeah.
points. I'll keep the remark brief. In our final chapter, we talk about democracy, and this brings up something that Marlene was mentioning earlier about the ways not in which authoritarianism and democracy are very, very distinct, but in fact there's some overlap, or there's a question of how democratic are democracies truly. And something we touch on more sort of not always directly, but in part in the final chapter is the question of at what point are state institutions too autonomous in democracies, in liberal democracies today. So if you've ever heard of people talk about the deep state, or they talk about the uniparty, that you can vote for whoever you want, but nothing actually changes, right? The state continues to run as it always has. You can't get rid of the bureaucrats, all of that.
can't get rid of Clintons for the deep state.
All of this. And then it's not just the United States. In other democracies, Britain has a similar question about the civil service, civil servants who can't be fired and actually run all the ministries, so on and so forth. France has a professional cadre of bureaucrats that are created every year through major schooling endeavors that then filter in to the states and create cadres that are essentially pre-generated, right? So these are all democracies. The United States is a democracy, Great Britain's a democracy, France is a democracy. But we do note that state institutions are relatively autonomous. Bureaucracies are often fairly autonomous. And as a corollary to that, because you have much more accountability in democracies, and because the highest apex political offices are uncertain, you have always the chance of the population thinking state institutions are too autonomous. We argue, or we suggest in the concluding chapter, that this is part of the populism discussion. And in fact, part of democratic populism as experienced in the United States and elsewhere is this sense that the state institutions are too autonomous and that it brings it into the fight over politics for the highest office. I think that is an interesting sort of thread to pull that comes out of this as well, is that populism, at least in that reading then, is an almost natural aspect of democratic politics, and that there is always going to be a tension between the state institutions, which are more autonomous on average than in authoritarian regimes, when you have uncertain outcomes for the highest offices of the land. And when people are dissatisfied on those specific issues, you get populism. You get these reactions. So I think that's all.
Voilà. Do we take one more question? We still are on time. Yeah, we still are on time for that.
So this could be rather speculative, and I have no idea if you speculatively think about this in the future in the book, but the technology revolution with AI, but also just with basic surveillance technology. I mean, is this going to narrow the distance, so to speak, or the autonomy between various parts of these regimes when the top brass know with a lot of certainty what their colleagues in the bureaucracy, let's say, are thinking, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a question of, does this potentially move things along the spectrum, but in many countries toward actual totalitarianism rather than just authoritarianism? It's a very general question that I'm sure is very context specific, but I just raise it as something that, again, provocatively might influence the way you look at the spectrum generally.
Any thoughts from online?
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at this. One important point that we kind of, at least I'd like to make in here, is that democracies and autocracies are capable of repression. And so the introduction of these new technologies is going to enable both to repress more and become better at it. And so this is why it is important to not just reduce autocracy to just repressive systems and thinking about them that way, and then normatively think that democracy is just about freedoms and rights and rule of law. And so again, this is, ending where we started, that we should not think of these two types of regimes as this kind of dichotomous binary, and not essentialize them, and not romanticize them in particular ways. And the point that you make about AI and technological tools, these are tools that are sometimes manufactured within liberal democracies and then exported to autocratic regimes for use. Sometimes they're manufactured and pioneered in autocracies and then exported to democracies for them to use, and all of the CCTV footage and that democracies are now kind of relying on surveillance mirrors exactly the kinds of things we see in other places. And so it's good to not think about autocracies just as repressive regimes, but I'll pause there and hand it to others.
I will say that we did make I don't remember if it was a conscious choice or not, but China is not a case study in this book. Not because we don't think the argument applies, but because the party state is such a unique form of authoritarianism, in fact, this explicit fusion of party political power with the state institutions at all levels in a sort of pyramidal relationship. We would want to explore it to some degree, not separately, but distinctly. But of course, China is the big question on AI and the integration of AI into social control mechanisms and features. You talk about the potential of totalitarianism, almost the movement society, the constant surveillance and overwatch. We see in places like Russia, the development of smart city technology, partially derived from the Chinese, but also indigenous, organic to Moscow and other major cities. And one aspect of the Russian case is that it's broadly been a victory for bureaucratic efficiency. It's actually been generally quality of life improvements overall. Marlene mentioned that you can, there's portals, government portals where you can submit complaints, but it's even better than that. You have an app on your phone and you can submit a complaint when the utilities aren't working in your apartment building. In the same app, you can use to vote. And so all of this is part of both authoritarian control, but also the increasing efficiency and capacity of those state institutions at the same time. And there can be unintended consequences on that.
No, and on that, not so dystopian.
Just wait till it comes here.
Comments. Yeah, exactly. I think it's time for us to conclude. I think it's kind of nicely clothing the circle about, right? When we talk about autocracy, we are also talking about democracy. So please join me in thanking our four speakers and author of the book. Congratulations again. Please read the book. You can find it online and in open access, as it was told. And we thank you for joining us for this book series. Thank